All right, so when it comes to setting tile and you're going to be installing a stone, like this is going to be slate, but if it was marble, if it was travertine, it was something natural, that is a natural stone, you're going to want to have a minimum layer of plywood and substrate over joists that are 16 inches on center. Rule of thumb to be safe, to make sure that none of this cracks and can last a long time, is 1.25 inches of submaterial. So these are 3/4 inch thick, and unfortunately you can't just tile directly over it. Even if you're going to do porcelain or ceramic or something like that, the expansion contraction of these smaller joints would end up transferring to the tile and possibly create cracking within the tile, or at the very minimum the grout joints. And you unfortunately can't use a membrane either for that, because the membranes can't adhere onto something that moves that much. So you need to isolate these floorboards. This is kind of like a pine Douglas fir. It's not really hardwood. I mean, you could refinish it to hardwood, but it's great stuff. It's been around for 100 years and it's probably been here for 100 years. But you're going to probably either want to remove it and put all new plywood in, or just go over it with 1/2 inch plywood. Now, you know, you might be asking, why can't I just use some 1/4 inch material for that? Well, this is great for laminates, but not so good for tile. And the reason is when the Thinset dries on this, the Thinset shrinks a little bit and can cause this to bubble up and pop open, you know, pop up essentially. So even if you try to fasten this down as much as you can, the chances of the Thinset causing an issue is pretty, you know, substantial. So I would advise against that, and I'm saying this because of experience. I've installed many floors with 1/4 inch material over it because we're trying to reduce the amount of height in a bathroom, and I've used this many times, and a couple of times it's failed on me quite significantly. So usually it's particularly like the smaller mosaics that you go over this with that would really be the issue. I've not had that issue with 12 by 24s, but it's not really a good material to go over for tile. Even with a membrane that you're going to be going over it, it's just not really that good. The best way is just to do 1/2 inch plywood going over top of this. Now that will give us that 1.25 inches that we need for the stone installation. Now these are all guidelines by the TCNA on installing tile, installing stone. So these are like the highest standards, or these are the standards that would make sure that this is going to last a very long time. Could you go over 3/4 inch plywood with a stone and be okay? Most likely. But, you know, to be safe, if you have that 1.25 inches, it's going to make sure that the flexion between the joists are stiff enough and nothing's going to crack, and it'll last, you know, 100 years. So we're going to go ahead and overlay this with 1/2 inch plywood so that we can have the good substrate for our slate tile. So have plenty of expansion contraction. You want to leave like a 1/4 inch all the way around the perimeter of your room. And then we're going to be using some ring shank nails, and this is going to help really hold that plywood into place. So over this plywood that we just put down, we're going to use some Redguard Uncoupling membrane. It's always a good idea to separate the plywood layer from your tile, especially stone and marble or travertine or whatever type of natural product. This will kind of help eliminate the expansion contraction of the plywood from transferring into the actual tile joint. So stone is pretty sensitive, so I highly recommend using an uncoupling membrane. You basically just thin set this down into place using a 1/4 by 1/4 inch trowel. You want to use a modified thin set, and then you could see how soupy this mixture is. You wouldn't want to set tile with this, but it's going to work great for adhering to the back of the membrane. So 1/4 by 1/4 square notch trowel or just a notch trowel, and then we'll set this, and then we can move right on to the tiling process. Okay, so this has a fleece. It's kind of double-sided in a way. So you just want the basically the waffle part to be showing on the top surface. And that's why this Thinset being so loose really helps out. It makes sure that you embed this well with the fleece. If you have too dry of a mixture with your Thinset, it's not going to bond properly. So the first step is to just take a damp sponge, wipe down your surface, get any dust or debris off of it, and this will help keep that Thinset from being zapped immediately, but also it helps glide that Thinset over the substrate. And you just want to take the flat side of your trowel, burn it into the substrate. This is just basically working the Thinset into the substrate. This will also give you better trowel lines when you go to actually start applying the Thinset. Okay, so then you want to just embed this into the substrate. You can use a grout float or a wood block to do this. And you want to check your coverage too. Make sure that you are getting good coverage here. It's not going to hurt to show the coverage. So I have a little bit of a bare spot there. So we'll just make sure that we address that. But really all you're looking for is 90% of the coverage. So that should work. And then if you wanted to waterproof these seams, go around the perimeter room, you'd have to put some membrane over top of each seam, but I'm not really overly concerned about that in this half bathroom. My priority is just to isolate the plywood from the tile layer. Okay, so to set slate tile, so a natural stone, I usually like to go with an unmodified Thinset. Main reason is because it's less likely to adhere to the top of the tile, or it's just a little bit easier to scrape off and remove. Some of the polymer modified Thinsets can be very, very problematic to get off a natural stone. Now we did seal this, so we're in good shape with that. That'll help prevent any Thinset from adhering to the top surface of it. But it is a good idea to just use a unmodified Thinset for this. It's just going to be a little bit easier to clean up the next day and ensure that you're not really ingraining too much Thinset on that. The other thing you can do is just be extremely clean during the process. That would make a world of difference as well. So we're just going to use custom blend. One nice thing about the unmodified stuff, it's pretty cheap. I mean, $10 a bag. And for a floor, I don't really see the point of spending a whole lot of money on Thinset for a floor. A floor is pretty easy when it comes to setting, and they all kind of, even if it's not not a very good non-sag quality Thinset, it still goes down pretty easily. So Make sure you pay attention to the backup bag, use the right amount of water for it. We're gonna be using 6 quarts per bag here. And I went with the gray Thinset as well. And really the only reason I went with that is because I do have a black tile, and anything that has, you know, like a black darker color, I wouldn't want to go with white just in case that it would bleed through. The opposite is true when you use marble, white marble. You don't want to be using a gray Thinset, you want to be using a white Thinset. Sometimes the gray can darken the tile just from the Thinset bonding and, you know, absorbing into the tile. So just know that stone is absorbent. So whatever you're using, make sure that you're sealing it and that you know, you're using the right colors to keep it from doing it. So we're going to be using a gray Thinset with a dark black slate. So in this L-shaped room, I particularly think it's best to basically have your 12 by 24s with the long section of the room. It's all personal preference. You can lay it however you want, but most of the time when you're running hardwood or something through a home, you usually go the long way with the house. It also kind of, in a way, makes it a little bit easier with this L shape because I can start over here, work my way out, and don't have to, you know, have too much difficulty overcoming the area. So the way I normally just do it, I'm a visual person, so I like to just lay out my tile just to get a feel and a reference of the dimension of what we're going here. Now this room is completely out of square, so we'll go over what we're going to do on that to make sure that this looks right. Just to start out, I'm just going to start from one wall to the other and take a look at what I have left. And this is going to help me determine the difference. You can obviously measure this, but to me, I really just kind of want to see the actual space here and see what I'm working with. But since I'm out of square, I know I'm going to have to give myself a decent cut piece so I don't end up with any slivers at the corner. So bringing this over, I'm just giving about a 16th inch grout joint. That's all I'm going to do on this. It's like I have about a 6-inch piece left over. So the way I would do that is just cut 3 inches off of each side and start from there. So we can cut a piece that's 3 inches off and work our way this way. Now as far as square, you know, let's reference this wall first. So I have this little bump out wall that comes out. So let me just put a straight edge right against that wall and determine what this looks like from each wall. So I got 48.5, 48 3/8, pretty close. So if I were to go with this, it's going to keep this all nice and straight. Let's see what we have over here. So I got 40 3/4, 41. It's not actually too bad. So use that as our reference point. We can lay all this tile and then set this tile and work our way out of the bathroom. Okay, so from this distance to here we have 80 and a half. So 40 1/4 would be the center. Now that kind of creates a problem because if I started out my pattern half that get equal sides, I'll end up with a 16.5-inch piece. That's not going to work. I'm doing a third pattern, so every 8 inches, and that would screw up my pattern. So I'm just going to offset off the center 3 inches. So basically cutting a full tile 3 inches off of the first row and then consecutively all the way through. So we'd have a 3.5-inch piece against that side and continuing the same pattern over here. So little off from here, basically 1.5 inch difference on either cut, but that's the sacrifice we have. But so we're just going to keep our level right here, work our way this way, and let's make some cuts to start out first. Okay, so one thing about slate or natural stone, basically everything needs to be cut on a wet saw. So it's definitely more labor intensive, and this is one of the reasons why a lot of contractors charge more money for stone or marble. Not only the care that you have to take with it, sealing it, making sure that you don't scratch it, and then also sometimes there's fussiness with the texture and the look of each piece, which would take more time discussing with the client or trying to determine how to go about setting the pattern, especially when it comes to marble. Marble can be varied so much and everyone has an opinion about it. So if you're doing a walk-in shower or doing a bathroom remodel and you're a contractor, you definitely have to charge more for doing natural stone, just because of the care, the sealing, and everything else that goes along with it. So, and then having to use this on a wet saw definitely hogs up some time too. I'm fortunate enough that this is a flip home. I don't have the floor out here done yet, so I can just walk right over and use the wet saw. But if you're on a second story, running up 3 flights of stairs to get to your position, it's going to take you a lot longer. So, but we're going to cut 3 inches off of these tiles so that we can have the right amount of reveal. That works. Okay, so cutting around our toilet flange, let's get a measurement. 11 3/4, so we'll make it 11 1/2. We want to give ourselves a little bit of expansion contraction in the back there. And then off of our edge here, got 5 inches. So then I would just take, I just always have this on hand. These are spacers. Okay, so on soft stone like this, you can just use a grinder blade like this and just go all the way around. Try to keep the dust down. So a couple other things that we're going to do to make installing this slate easier is to use some leveling clips, and then we have a little protectors just in case to prevent you from scratching it when you slide these clips on. So all stone can be easily scratched, so you want to make sure you use the precautions on that. This is the tile leveling system called Perfect Level Master. We're also going to be using a 1/4 by 1/2 inch notch trowel, or a 3/8 by 1/2 inch trowel. So this is going to give us plenty of thinset to work with and get it to where, you know, nice and level to where we want it. Our Calidad 1-inch bit slides onto a grinder. You can see all those diamonds. It'll definitely cut through this pretty nicely. No problem at all. Okay, so anytime you run your slate through the wet saw, you want to wipe it down, get that water off there. Not have much waste left whatsoever. That's basically my waste right there. Definitely called it close, and I accidentally broke that last tile that I needed, so I had to put some pieces in here on the right hand side. I'm not really happy about that, but you know, I don't think anybody's gonna really notice. white scrubby pad. We'll get this extra Thinset off of here. So when you're in an old house, I highly recommend you just cope your trim rather than putting 45s on it. So all you do is cut a 45 on your baseboard and then just follow the line of your edging. This way you don't get any big gaps, and then you can measure from that point to what you need. You can just put this into place, and it's always a nice fit. So on this slate floor, I'm gonna grout it with some black grout. You can't go wrong with black. This is gonna be the most used bathroom in the home because it's the half bathroom on the first floor. So I definitely recommend getting a darker type of grout for a real traffic area, just because it's not gonna stain. But what I am using is Mapei FA. So this is a high performance grout. It doesn't need sealed, and it's a really fine consistency. It's kind of in between like a sanded and a non-sanded grout, so it can go down to 16th inch grout joints. But what I really like about it is that I can move on with the project with this very quickly. It takes about 20 minutes to set up. I could remove it, and then almost an hour later I can start working on top of it because everything's been completely hardened and dried. When you're going over stone, slate like this, you want to seal it before you do the grouting. A lot of times some of this stone is very porous, and there's some areas and cracks and stuff that makes it very difficult to get the grout out of on top of the surface. So we already sealed this prior to grouting it, and we actually did 2 coats because we did one before we actually set the slate and then one after we had all the tiles set. So 2 sealings, definitely gonna keep this looking good for a really long time. I'm only gonna need about a half a bag, so I'm not gonna mix the whole thing. Basically just follow the instructions, make sure that you're mixing the right amount of water. I'm gonna use basically a half a quart of water for half of this bag, and then move right into grouting. All right, so I would definitely recommend getting a good grout float. This is made by Trox. It's a very nice flexible grout float, much better than any of those regular rubber gasketed bottom ones. And it's just basically a 4x9 grout float. But I do like the stiffness of this. This is really primarily meant for urethane premixes, but it really works great for every type of tile. So the goal here is just to fill in the joints. Don't be overly concerned about the grout on top of the tile. That'll be very easy to clean off in the later stages. So right now, the most important thing is just to fill all those joints. I'd also recommend getting a decent sponge. This is pretty well used from the project in this house, but Ardex sponges are really great. I also have a spare sponge as well. I kind of ran out of them, but you're just your standard typical sponge as well. But the Ardex sponges really help clean things off, does a really great job. So we'll go ahead and just get started here. I'm just embedding this into the grout joints. But what's so great about this is that it does set pretty fast, and depending on your humidity. So if you're in a dry climate and you have sunlight possibly coming into your bathroom, this stuff is going to set up fairly quickly. So you have to be careful with it. Quickly, I mean in about 10 minutes. So try, if you have to mix smaller quantities because of some of those issues, I would definitely recommend doing that. Because once this stuff sets up, it gets really difficult to remove, and it's really about timing with this of when to remove and tool these joints nicely. So scrape the excess off on a 45-degree angle, but don't worry too much about it being on the surface. It'll all come off. It's probably really tough to see on camera here because it's black. This is definitely a midnight black. But it's definitely going to be stain resistant, that's for sure. Black is really going to be tough to see any problems with dirt or anything like that. So damping the surface with a damp sponge helps glide this over as well. Now I did put my baseboard on before grouting. Ultimately it'd be nicer to grout before you put the base trim on, but I'm kind of in a rush and the timing just worked out where I wanted to get that trim on there. So not a big deal, but grouting before base trim would be ideal so that you can get those grout joints all the way into the corners, but not a big deal. What I like about this is how fine of a consistency it is. It's really a solid grout, but I think having a finer grit makes it easier to clean. Kind of like the unsanded grouts, but this gives it a little bit more structure with the aggregate that's in here. So it'll basically last a lot longer than a unsanded grout. Okay, so we'll just let that set for about 20 minutes and we'll remove the excess. Okay, so about 25 minutes later, you can see that it's starting to dry on the surface of the tile. Biggest thing you want to do is be able to touch the grout and not pull it out on your finger. So if you're able to kind of mold it a little bit with your hands, that's kind of what you want, because when you go to tool it with the sponge, you don't want to be pulling the grout out of the joint. So it's, keep testing it as time goes on. Like I said, if you're in a dry environment, this is going to go much quicker, but I've been waiting about 25 minutes and it's just now able to start pushing the joints and I'm not getting any of the grout pulling out of the joint. You always test the spot too and just make sure that you're not pulling it out of the joint. Circular motions help the best. So just pay attention to the joints when you're doing this, and if you're pulling any of the grout out, then you're gonna have to just wait a little bit longer. But this looks pretty good to me. It's gonna be really tough for you to see with the black grout, but definitely get 2 buckets of water at least with a black grout. This stuff will really turn pretty dingy pretty quickly. So usually, like once you start seeing that drying on the surface, that's usually when it's ready to go. Just the initial signs of it where it's kind of drying up. That's usually when you're ready to start removing the excess. Okay. So once that dries, then we can take the haze off a few hours later. All right, so nothing fun about a 1-inch transition. So this is basically 1 inch off of my laminate flooring. Basically I had a 1/2-inch plywood, I had an uncoupling membrane, and then I actually had the thick slate tile. So I ended up with an 1-inch overhang. So what I did was basically modified a transition strip here. So as you can see, this is made for 2 different levels of flooring. So basically like a 3/4 inch flooring and then your laminate flooring. So the laminate is only about 3/8 of an inch thick. So I cut one of these tabs off of the ends and basically this is just gonna go right over top of the edge of my tile and go right on the edge. So that works out well. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna sink nails diagonally into the plywood. But I also think it's a good idea to put some clear silicone on the outside edge. This is just kind of helps secure it a little bit and adheres it to the laminate flooring. Biggest thing is you don't want to be putting any nails into the laminate flooring. That needs room to breathe. So let's just go ahead and put this like so. And I got some 2-inch or 2.5-inch really brad nails. So you really can't beat the look of natural slate. Gives a really classic warm feel to it. So the 12x24s were a great choice for here. One thing that you really still, again, you want to pay attention to is that when you have to beef up your subfloor, you're going to end up with a larger transition. So We're basically 1 inch over top of our laminate flooring. We're able to use a threshold like this that worked out really well. So just know that natural stone is going to take up a little bit more space if you want to make it like a sound installation. But slate is definitely a way to go. Great classic warm feel.